Montana Territory, June 1882. The storm had passed, but the ground still held the prints of her boots deep, frantic, and headed west. Garrett Langston knelt beside them, fingers brushing the edge of one track, the leather reins looped around his wrist. The wind tugged at his coat, but he did not move. Not yet. She's scared, he muttered, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. But she ain't hurt. Not yet. He stood, swung into the saddle, and nudged his horse forward. He had been following her for nearly a full day now. Another would make it too. The trail twisted along the river, cut through cottonwood groves, and vanished in rocky gullies, but she was not careful enough to hide it. Not from him. Garrett had known her since she showed up in town 3 months ago, dust on her hem and a baby boy in her arms. She had taken work at the boarding house, quiet but clean, kind but distant. Her name was Adalline Rosewood. She never said where she came from, but Garrett had seen enough pain in his life to know when someone was running from it. Now she was running again. He had found the boy first, Gabriel, barely 3 left, on the porch of Miss Lorna's with only a note pinned to his shirt. "Please keep him safe. I am sorry." Garrett had read it once, then folded it and put it in his coat. He had stared at the child, asleep on a quilt, and something inside him turned sharp. He saddled his horse by sunup and followed her tracks north. By the second nightfall, the trail led through the edge of the Bitterroot Range. The air turned colder, the trees thicker. She was traveling light, no food, no shelter. Just fear and guilt driving her deeper into nowhere. He found her near midnight, curled beneath a pine tree, shaking so hard her knees knocked together. She did not hear the horse until he slid down from it and stepped toward her, boots crunching soft over pine needles. Her eyes darted up. "No," she whispered, scrambling back, hands in the dirt. "Garrett, please, you do not run from me," he said, voice low, even. "Ever?" Her shoulders crumpled, tears streaking down her cheeks. I had to. I thought they'd come for me. I thought if I left Gabriel behind, they wouldn't." "They who?" he asked, crouching down in front of her. His coat brushed against her shins. "Adalline talked to me." She shook her head, arms wrapping tight around her frame. "I have made too many mistakes. I thought if I stayed, I would bring danger to him. I thought if I left, maybe he had a chance." "You could have come to me," he said, quieter now. "You never even tried." She looked up, her eyes rimmed red. "Why would you help me? I am no one. I have nothing." Garrett reached out then slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not. His hand found hers, cold and scraped raw. "You are not nothing," he said. "You are the strongest damn woman I have ever met. You walked into that town with a child on your hip and never asked for a thing, but I watched you. I saw how you looked at him when you thought nobody noticed. You love that boy." "I do," she breathed. "More than anything. Then come back with me. You do not have to run anymore." She blinked, lips trembling. "What if it is too late? What if someone's already looking for me?" "Then let them come," Garrett said, rising to his feet and pulling her gently up with him. "They will have to go through me first." Her knees gave a little, but he caught her easily. She sagged into his chest and he held her there, strong arms wrapping around her shaking frame. "You came after me," she whispered. "I would have ridden all the way to Canada if I had to," he said, pressing his cheek to her hair. "You and that boy, you are not alone anymore." Adalline let herself cry then, not from fear but from something else, something that started to feel like safety. They rode out by morning. Garrett kept her close, the trail home quiet except for the birdsong and the soft creak of saddle leather. When she dozed against his shoulder, he let her. When she woke, she found his hand covering hers. By the time the rooftops of the town came into view, a weight had lifted from her chest she had carried for 3 years. Gabriel was waiting on Miss Lorna's porch, eyes wide the moment he saw her. He ran, arms outstretched, and Adalline fell to her knees in the dust, clutching him so fiercely he squealed. Garrett stood back, hands on his hips, then knelt beside them. "I told you," he said, voice soft, "you do not run from me." Adalline looked up at him, her son clinging to her neck, and for the first time she smiled. Not with fear, not with sadness, with hope. He reached out, brushing a leaf from her hair. "You ready to come home?" she nodded. "Yes." "With you." His hand closed around hers again, and this time she held it just as tightly. The sun hung low behind the ridgeline by the time Garrett stepped through the boarding house door. Gabriel curled quiet against his shoulder. Miss Lorna took the child without a word, her hands practiced and gentle as she carried him to the back room. Garrett watched the boy disappear through the curtain, then turned to where Adalline stood just inside the threshold, her arms folded across her middle. She hadn't spoken since they'd come down off the mountain. "You want to sit down?" Garrett asked, motioning to the worn settee by the stove. Adalline glanced around the parlor, neat, dim, smelling faintly of lye soap and dried sage, and shook her head. "It's too quiet in here." He didn't press. Instead, he moved toward the window, pushed it open an inch to let in the evening air. Outside, the wind carried the sound of hammers from the livery, someone shouting across the street. Life, steady and unbothered. "You didn't ask where I came from," she said behind him. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Adalline stepped further inside, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorway as though unsure whether she belonged in that room or not. "Kansas. A tenant farm near Leavenworth. My husband died after the second frost. Fever took him fast." Garrett turned. She didn't meet his eyes. "His brother came after, said I owed him the land, said I owed him more than that. I took Gabriel and left in the night. We walked for days before a wagon driver took pity and hauled us as far as Billings." He stayed silent, letting her speak as long as she needed. "I thought I was safe here," she said, voice thinning. "But last week I saw a man outside the mercantile that looked like him. Not exact, but close enough to twist my stomach cold. I didn't wait to be sure, I just ran." Garrett crossed the room. "You're not wrong for that." "I left my son on a porch with a note," she said, eyes finally rising. "That's not the choice of someone strong. That's the choice of someone desperate." He shook his head, slow and certain. "No. That was the choice of a mother trying to protect her child with the only tools she had left." Adalline looked at him then, really looked, and something in her face softened, not from relief, but from recognition. Like she hadn't expected anyone to name her choices anything but shame. "You got any kin left?" Garrett asked. "No. My folks passed before I married, and my husband was an only child before his brother came back from serving in Virginia. There's no one else." He nodded once. "Then you've got room to start over." She gave a short, breathless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Doing what? Scrubbing floors for pennies and hoping no one else recognizes me? You could stay here," he said. "Not just in town with me." Her brows lifted, uncertain. "I got land west of the river. Cabin's small but solid. You can have your own room. Take time to figure things out, you and the boy." Adalline hesitated. "Why would you offer that?" Garrett crossed his arms, boots planted wide. "You think I rode across 2 counties to drop you off and forget you?" "You matter, Adalline, not because of what you've lost, because of who you are right now in front of me." She looked away, jaw tightening. "What are you afraid of?" he asked. "That if I let myself lean on you, I won't know how to stop," she whispered. He stepped forward, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Then lean." Adaline's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "I don't want you to feel like you have to fix me." "I don't," he said. "But I damn sure want to stand beside you while you fix yourself." Outside, dusk settled deeper, the sky turning the color of worn denim. Inside, she closed the space between them, not with her body but with her trust. She nodded once, slow and steady. "All right," she said. "We'll come." Garrett didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply reached for her hand and she let him take it. When they left the boarding house, Gabriel was already asleep again, curled beneath a quilt in Miss Lorna's front room. Garrett lifted him without waking him, and Adalline followed without hesitation. They walked down Main Street, past the shuttered mercantile and the blacksmith's forge, toward the edge of town where Garrett's horse waited tied beside another gelding he'd borrowed from the livery. As he helped Adalline into the saddle, she looked down at him, her eyes clearer than they'd been since he'd found her in the woods. "If I'm going to start over," she said, "I want to learn how to ride proper." Garrett adjusted the stirrup and looked up. "We'll start tomorrow." She nodded, and they rode out together under the cover of twilight, the boy safe between them and the road ahead wide with possibility. They reached Garrett's land by morning, the cabin standing quiet between a thicket of alder and a bend in the creek. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney he'd sent one of the Carlson boys ahead the day before to ready the stove and lay fresh bedding. The boy had done his job. The shutters were open, the fire warm, and a pot of beans simmered low on the hob. Adalline stepped down from the horse with Gabriel still asleep against her chest. Garrett took the reins and led both horses around back to the lean-to, giving her the moment to settle. She didn't ask where to put her things. She didn't need to. There were only 2 rooms in the cabin, and the small one off the kitchen held a cot and a wash basin already waiting. When Garrett came back inside, he found her standing barefoot on the plank floor, staring at the rough-hewn shelves stacked with jars of dried apples and pickled beans, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. "You hungry? I should see to Gabriel first," she said, eyes flicking toward the back room. "He's still sleeping," Garrett said. "Let him rest. He's got time now." She nodded but didn't move. "You want coffee?" he asked. She turned, and something about the question, simple, ordinary, drew the tension from her shoulders. "I'd like that," she said. He poured from the pot warming on the stove, handed her the tin cup. Her fingers brushed his just once, but neither of them pulled away. They drank in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the creek chattered over stone and a jay called from the branches above the roof. Garrett leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the steam rise from his cup. "You built this place yourself?" she asked. "Took me 2 winters. Hauled the logs from the north slope, had help raising the beams, but the rest's mine." "You always lived alone, since my brother passed. He was the talker between us. I was better at fences and keeping quiet." Her gaze lingered on his face a moment. "You're not what I expected. What you expect, something colder." She looked down into her cup. Something the world hadn't touched so gently. Garrett's jaw shifted. "The world's touched me plenty, just doesn't show as loud." She set her cup down. "I'd like to help with the chores." "I can't sit and be waited on." "You won't have to." He stepped aside, motioning toward the door. "There's eggs to gather and the creek's low enough to rinse linens. I've got a smokehouse half built out back if you've got the stomach for clearing cedar." "I've split worse," she said, and for the first time since they left town, her voice held something close to pride. They spent the day working. She moved with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair tied back with a length of cotton ribbon Garrett hadn't seen her wear until now. Gabriel woke near noon, blinking sleep from his eyes, and Adalline knelt beside him, smoothing his hair before leading him outside to sit beneath the shade of the alder while she scrubbed the wash. Garrett handed the boy a whittled horse from the shelf. Gabriel clutched it tight, then leaned against the porch post, content. By evening, the sun dipped behind the ridge, laying gold across the fields. Garrett was stacking the last beam on the smokehouse frame, hammer still in hand, when Adalline came around the side of the cabin, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I boiled the potatoes," she said. "I didn't know if you salted the beans already." "I did." "You like onions?" "I do." "Then it's ready." They ate with the windows open, voices low. Gabriel sat between them, spoon in hand, eyes flicking from one adult to the other like he was still figuring out where he belonged. When he dozed off again, Adalline carried him to the cot and tucked the quilt over his shoulders without a word. Garrett sat back in his chair, watching the way her hand lingered on the boy's back. "You said your husband was kind to him," he said, once she returned to the table. "He was," she replied. Even after knowing Gabriel wasn't his, he never asked for the name. Garrett didn't speak, but his eyes met hers and held. "Gabriel's father was a man I trusted once," she said, voice steady. "He never meant to stay, but I was young and I believed him. By the time I knew the truth, I had nothing left to offer anyone but the child growing inside me." Garrett didn't shift away. He waited, quiet and unmoving. "I don't carry hope easy," she said. "I used to, but not now." "Hope ain't light," he said. "Hope's heavy. You carry it when nothing else makes sense, and it hurts more than it helps some days." Adalline rubbed her palms together as if trying to warm them. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. "You're already giving it," he replied. She looked up. "What am I giving? Room for something better. And that's more than anybody's asked of me in a long while." A hush settled between them, softer than before. Not empty, just waiting. She rose, slow and unhurried, and crossed to stand beside him. She reached for his hand, not in need but in quiet offering. He took it without hesitation. They stood like that until the fire burned low, the night pressing cool against the windows. No promises were made, none were needed. The first piece of something lasting had already settled between them, quiet, certain, and real as the land beneath their feet. By the second week, the rhythms of life on Garrett's land had begun to settle into something steady. Adalline rose before sunup each day, her sleeves rolled and hair pinned, not out of obligation but because the work grounded her. Gabriel had taken to following Garrett around the property, mimicking his stride, his gestures, even the way he leaned against the fence rails. Garrett hadn't said anything about it, but Adalline caught his quiet glances, proud, surprised, a little unsure of what it meant to be looked up to. That morning, Adalline was in the garden plot behind the cabin, clearing out the last of the winter thick weeds. The soil was stubborn, but she didn't mind the ache in her palms or the grain of dirt under her nails. She'd asked Garrett for a corner of the land to plant. He hadn't asked why. He stepped out of the barn with a pitchfork in one hand and a salt block slung over his shoulder. "You're turning that ground over like it talked back to you." She looked up, squinting against the sun. "I've never had a patch of earth that was mine. I wanted to know I mean business." Garrett set the fork aside and crouched near her. "You thinking potatoes, maybe? Beans if the frost holds off long enough. Wild onions if I can find where they grow near the creek." His eyes flicked toward her hands. "You'll wear your knuckles raw. I don't mind." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached for her wrist, his calloused thumb brushing a scrape she hadn't noticed. "If you want gloves, I've got a pair inside." She held still, watching the way his brow furrowed as he looked her over like she was something precious, not fragile. "You always fuss this much." "I don't fuss." His hand dropped away and he stood. "I pay attention." She pressed her palms to her knees and stood as well. "You weren't always on this land, were you?" "No." "Where were you before?" He hesitated, then looked out toward the pines. "I rode for a freight company out of Bozeman. Before that, I was on a drive down through Nebraska. Wintered in Wyoming once, kept moving." "What made you stop?" "My brother's letter. Said he'd found a piece of land worth holding on to. I came to see it, ended up building the cabin with him. He passed before we could finish the second room. She didn't speak. The wind stirred the hem of her skirt. I stayed because it felt like something he'd want finished, Garrett added. Adalline studied his face. You ever think about leaving again? Not since you stepped through that boarding house door. His voice held no weight of confession, no expectation. Just a fact spoken plain. She looked down at the dark-turned earth, then back to him. I don't know how to answer that. You don't have to. Not now. That evening after supper, Garrett brought out the fiddle from the chest at the foot of his bed. It was old, worn smooth at the neck and missing the fine tuners. He didn't offer to play it, just set it on the hearth and began tightening the strings. Gabriel padded over in stocking feet and stared. What is it? Garrett glanced over. A fiddle. My ma used to play. I kept it from her things. You gonna make music? Garrett gave a quiet breath of amusement. That's the idea. Adalline looked up from her stitching. You any good? Only one way to find out. He set bow to string and drew a slow, wavering note from the instrument. The sound was rough, a little thin but not unpleasant. Gabriel climbed into Adaline's lap, eyes wide. Garrett played a simple tune, one meant for dancing, though no one moved. When he finished, the last note hanging soft in the low, ceilinged room, Adalline clapped once. I didn't know you carried tunes. There's a lot you don't know. She met his eyes. I'd like to. He stood, placing the fiddle back in its case. Then I'll keep showing you. That night, after Gabriel had been carried to bed and the fire burned low, Adalline lingered near the hearth. Garrett stood beside her, neither of them speaking. The quiet between them had changed. It was no longer filled with caution, but with something waiting. I never let myself imagine what peace might feel like, she said. Garrett didn't reach for her, didn't move closer. He just watched her, steady and unflinching. You don't have to imagine, he said. You're living it. She turned her head, her breath catching just slightly. It doesn't feel real yet. Then let's make it real, one day at a time. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped forward and rested her head against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, slow and sure, like he'd been waiting for her to allow it. The wind outside rustled the alder leaves. The cabin held still. And for the first time in years, Adalline let herself believe she was exactly where she was meant to be. The last frost passed in the night with only a lace of hoarfrost clinging to the fence rails by dawn. Adalline stood barefoot on the stoop, mug of hot chicory in hand, watching mist rise off the creek. The air smelled of thawed earth and damp pine. Somewhere upstream, a woodpecker knocked patiently at bark. Inside, the cabin stirred slowly. Gabriel was still curled beneath his quilt, one hand beneath his cheek, the wooden horse Garrett had carved tucked beside him. Garrett stepped out behind her, coat open, boots unlaced. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, shoulder brushing hers. I found wild onion shoots yesterday, she said. Down past the bend, I can dig them up this afternoon. Garrett's eyes followed the creek. You planning to dry them or cook them down? Both. I'll show you how, he nodded once. I'll mend the fence along the east pasture, one of the rails split. Might be from elk, might be rot. She sipped her drink, then passed it to him. He took it without hesitation, drank, and passed it back. They didn't speak again for several minutes. The silence between them had grown easy, not empty, but full of understanding that didn't need explaining. Later, after breakfast and chores, Adalline took Gabriel down to the creek bank while Garrett rode out to the pasture. She showed the boy how to look for smooth stones and where the minnows darted between shadows. He laughed when she slipped on a mossy rock and caught herself with her palm in the water. And she laughed too, not because of the fall, but because her son hadn't laughed like that in months. By midday, she had a basket half full of wild onion and rabbit tobacco, and Gabriel was asleep in the shade of a cottonwood, his head in her lap. Garrett returned near evening, a long scratch down one forearm and sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He found her in the garden, sleeves pushed to the elbow, a streak of dirt across her cheek. "You win," she asked, leaning on the handle of the rake. "The fence won the first round. I got it back on the second." He glanced over her shoulder at the neat rows she'd marked in the soil. "You get those seeds down. Tomorrow, I want to wait for steadier sun." He reached out, brushed a leaf from her sleeve. "You always this patient?" "No," she said, "but I'm learning." That night after supper, Adalline wiped her hands on her apron and looked across the table. "Would you come with me to the Reverend's this week?" Garrett set down his fork. "For what?" "I want to make things proper for Gabriel, for us." She didn't look away. "I don't want to live in between anymore." He studied her face, then stood and rounded the table. When he reached her, he went to one knee, not for show, but because it felt right. "I've had your hand in mine since I found you under that pine tree," he said. "But if you want me to speak it out loud, I will right here. I want to marry you, Adalline, not out of duty." "Because I love you," her breath caught. Not from surprise she had known, but from the weight of hearing it, spoken plain. "I love you too," she said, voice thick. He stood and pulled her to her feet, kissing her forehead first, then her lips. It was slow, steady, and warm, a promise, not a question. They married at the edge of the meadow 3 days later, with Gabriel clutching a ring of daisies and Miss Lorna standing witness. The Reverend came from town in a wagon, black coat dusted with pollen, and pronounced them husband and wife beneath the open sky. Adalline wore a dress she'd sewn from calico scraps, and Garrett helped pin her hair with a cedar comb he'd carved the night before. Gabriel stood between them, his fingers tucked in both their hands. Afterward, they shared bread and sugar apples with the neighbors who'd come, and Gabriel ran himself breathless with 2 boys from the Carlson place. Garrett stayed close to Adaline's side, not possessive, just sure of his place beside her. When the sun dipped low and the guests departed, Garrett carried Gabriel inside and laid him in his cot. Adalline stood in the doorway, watching. "You never asked me what kind of man Gabriel's father was," she said. "I didn't need to." She stepped to Garrett's side. "He never looked at me the way you do." Garrett turned toward her. "How's that? Like I'm the rest of your story?" "You are." That night they lay in the quiet cabin, bodies close beneath the quilt, windows open to the night breeze. Garrett's hand rested over Adaline's, their fingers still stained from work, their hearts steady. In the weeks that followed, the garden took root. Beans climbed their stakes, and wildflowers bloomed along the creek. Gabriel grew sun-browned and strong, his laughter common as bird call. Garrett taught him to hold a hammer, then how to listen for the sound of weather in the wind. Adalline taught him to knead bread and name the stars. They worked the land together, built a smokehouse, planted another row of squash. They shared the weight of days, the quiet of nights, the hush of sunrise. One afternoon, as summer leaned toward autumn, Adalline stood on the porch, watching Garrett and Gabriel walk back from the pasture hand in hand, a split rail slung across Garrett's shoulder. She touched her belly, a secret pressing just beneath her palm. Not fear, not doubt, just the beginning of something new. When Garrett reached the steps, he looked up at her as though he already knew. She smiled, and he smiled back. And in that wide, quiet corner of Montana territory, where the creek ran clear and the wind carried only the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves, they built a life that would hold. Not perfect, but true. They never left. They never needed to.